interesting that we have to have some time also for exchange. My name is Pavel Fischer. I will be your moderator of this panel. And I come from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Prague, from Czech Republic. I used to work as ambassador to France, and before that I used to work 8 years with the former president of the Republic, Václav Havel, dealing, among others, with international political issues, but also with the past. So I tried to be useful in this topical panel because we have some experience there as well. The name of this panel is Dealing with an Authoritarian Past. What does it mean? When we speak about history and web, we notice that there is some kind of territoriality of history. So it's difficult to speak about history without territory. I think that if we try to be as generous as possible and forget our sensitiveness or interpretations, then the interpretation of history becomes very difficult. The example of France and Germany trying to write together books of history for secondary students is one of these examples. It's a very tough job. And speaking about recent past has also something very sensitive, even more. We will speak about it during this panel, because I think that it is not only a matter for historians, but also some kind of very sensitive issue for the whole society. Because history, recent past, can be some kind of detonator that we have to deactivate. And I think that the issue is so interesting in every single region that we will try to speak about from, that I will now fade out and ask the first panelist to take the floor. My first panelist is Emmet Tuohy. He's research fellow from Tallinn, focused on security foreign policy issues, but he studied modern history and issues of nationalism and political transitions. So this identification with a territory and with a political project is, I think, very interesting while speaking about his recent experience. He will maybe do that himself. Emmet, maybe you could address the issue of past with also the aspect of transitional justice, because this is something that we meet in every single debate concerning past. Emmet will also introduce a short video clip at the end. Maybe not. We shall see. Emmet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks again to Pavel for the wonderful introduction, and to the organizers for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here in Tunisia. Now, when most people think of Estonia, especially this kind of audience, they probably think of exactly what Foreign Minister Payet said on the first day of the conference, which is e-Estonia, the country of technology, of e-government, of e-voting, etc., etc. Well, it's my privilege to introduce you to another side of the Estonian character, and that is pragmatism. Estonians are renowned throughout their own region for being the type of people to only talk when it's strictly necessary, to focus on things that are only truly important pragmatically. One commonly told joke in the country is about a man who loved his wife so very much that he almost told her. So, this is reflected in political terms as a sort of preference for avoiding extremist positions and to try to find elements of continuity amidst political change. This is the key factor that I'll argue today was responsible for the relative success that Estonia has shown in confronting its authoritarian past. But I should say at the outset that to say that it was pragmatic is not to say that it was aimless, it's not to say that it was half-hearted. Estonians knew from detailed experience with not one but two authoritarian regimes exactly what they wanted to avoid, And one more anecdote that was told towards the end of the Soviet period in Estonia to intellectuals who are discussing the future. One wonders, what will the future hold in a decade? The other responds, what's the point? We don't even know what our past will be by then. And transitional justice is the process of figuring out exactly what that past was and in coming to terms with it. But what is traditional justice then exactly? In one sense, it's a moral way of coming to terms with the past, of allowing victims to feel that their suffering has been recognized and for a symbolic page to be turned in a country's history. But it's more than that. Political scientists have said lately that no post-transition society, as we'll see from some examples in this region, can truly become liberal if old mythologies such as self-pity or of rationalization become monopoly on public discourse. And this is still a problem actually in the region of Estonia as well, such as the very large neighboring country to the east called Russia, in which over 65% of the population still believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, and that Joseph Stalin, who arguably holds the world's murder record at the moment, although with some competition, had done far more good than bad for Russia. So true transitional justice, I'm going to argue, needs to come from an awareness within the country itself that it needs to face its culpability in the past. International tribunals from Nuremberg afterwards certainly help in the narrow sense of punishing individually guilty parties. But as the criminal cases in The Hague in the former Yugoslavia have shown us, they're not sufficient because for years afterwards, political leaders have been reluctant to cooperate and they've continued to justify the actions and the ideologies that were responsible for those things in the first place. So what I'm going to talk about now are the three main elements of transitional justice that have been used in the Estonian case, and later we'll hear about some of the others such as truth commissions, reconciliation, etc. The first is lustration, which comes from a Latin word meaning to purify by the light. And this is to remove people who were culpable in the previous regime from participating politically in the new democratic state. The second is access to justice, specifically prosecuting those people responsible for serious crimes committed during the previous regime. And the third, access to truth, allowing citizens to find out what happened during the previous period, both as individuals by gaining access to the records that secret police had on them, and also as a society to get a full documentary record of the things that had happened, mostly in secret, some distorted, during the period of the previous regime. In Estonia, the lustration process was fairly moderate. It was mostly directed only at former secret police who were actively involved in repression and crimes against humanity. Unlike most countries in the former Soviet space, as Ambassador Fischer can attest to, here former members of the Estonian Communist Party were tolerated in public life, and with full awareness and debate, as I'll explain in a moment, about the moral ambiguities involved of allowing someone to continue. And it's also important to note that together with Latvia and Lithuania, Estonia was the only country in the former Soviet Union to actually undertake any form of lustration whatsoever. The process was begun in 1995 with the lustration law. It required people who collaborated with either the Nazi or the Soviet secret police or the Communist Party to register voluntarily to declare an oath of conscience that they had cooperated. If they did so, the government promised in return not to release any of the information and to keep it private. But if they didn't, and the government knew about it through access to some of the files, they promised to publish their names in official government newspapers called the Riigi Teataja, which was done actually in 2002. By the time the law expired, most Estonian observers considered it a large success. It did allow these collaborators themselves also to put their past behind them. In fact, some 1,200 former spies and informers came forward. But again, overall, the law was restricted carefully, and this is by design. There weren't that many guilty parties to target. A relatively small proportion of Estonians did participate in the repressive actions. And a lot of the Communist Party elite were actually from the center in Moscow and not from the Estonian Republican elite. Moreover, many of the local Estonian communist leaders claimed with some justification that they had pushed within the system to reform, that they had gotten autonomy from Moscow, that they had gotten some more civil liberties from Moscow. And so therefore it was them that actually deserves more of the credit than the civil society groups and the activists for actually having brought this out. And you see this kind of argument of working within versus working without the system in very many countries across the region. But what Estonia's lustration law allowed it to do was this debate was able to take place. Those who had murdered political opponents were banned from politics. But those who worked within the system had the chance to prove their case. And in fact, the last head of the Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic, called Arnold Rüütel, became the second president of Estonia. And while he was in office, he gave medals to many of his colleagues for having done their part working within the system to build a new Estonian state. The subsequent president, Ilves, came back and slammed this nostalgia, encouraging people to remember, which I agree with, that the Communist Party was not some kind of underground patriotic organization in the 1980s. It wielded brutal power, and it's important for people not to whitewash their own records. But again, this is how you do lustration. You keep it focused such that the truly guilty are out, and then in a democratic process, the truth can win out among the other two prevailing parties. Second method, I'll wrap it up relatively soon, is access to justice. Early on in Estonia, there were calls to try, in a judicial sense, nearly everyone who was involved in crimes in communism and also in crimes of the previous regime and Nazi occupation. But there's some practical problems with this, also things that we see throughout the region. First was that this definition is too broad. Since the nature of a totalitarian or authoritarian regime is that everyone is essentially a co-conspirator, you have to contribute to it in one way or another, whether to get a job or to get something for your children, a school place or whatever else, everyone is in some way complicit. And secondly, more practically, there's simply a lack of evidence. Secret police have gotten better and better over the years at destroying records, and furthermore, because of the passage of time, there weren't simply enough witnesses, or in many cases, defendants were dead. Nonetheless, Estonia has still shown the way in its region by taking 12 criminal cases to court and convicting several and sentencing them to prison terms, and even winning the appeals in the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that they weren't being prosecuted for their political beliefs, but they were prosecuted for murdering people based on a particular ethnic origin. And furthermore, that the excuse of it was legal at the time is not something that's going to work in international law after the example of Nuremberg. The third and final method that I'll talk about is access to records. The problem, how in Estonia, there weren't many records to access. Again, the KGB saw that the end was coming, and they took precautions. The incompleteness of the records that were left does create some problems for the country. Because it's selective, it can be used selectively by people who are left. Also, there's issues of authenticity. You don't necessarily know which documents are actually true if they're left behind. Obviously, secret police are known to make things up or to use falsified evidence in order to get people to collaborate. And so these were problems in using this evidence as the basis for a political process going forward. Therefore, in 1995, Estonia came up with a law on access to records, which states that citizens can read any files and observations compiled on themselves, and that anyone can read administrative information like agent reports, mission statements of secret police, and the files of arrestees. Because of Estonia's desire to protect privacy, as we heard a little bit about yesterday and the day before, and as I might talk about later, this law had to be revised later on because people were actually accessing these records not for historical truth or for a desire to come to terms with what they might have done in the past, but to find dirt on their political opponents. And there was one case where a prosecutor's record in sentencing some young boys for nationalist vandalism to prison was later used against him. And as a result, now people can only access records that are actually themselves. The rest will be opened up after about 50 or 60 years. And a related way of talking about access to records and what Estonia actually did in the absence of the complete files that were taken to Moscow during the fall of the Soviet Union was setting out a historical approach, not collecting information in order to sentence people to jail, but simply to establish the truth of what happened. And so President Weddady in 1999 created an international commission for the investigation of crimes against humanity. It was done by 7 international historians, and their remit was to investigate, to interview people, to put together a factual record for future generations, really, of exactly what happened. And as Leonard Merry said when he was creating the panel, we can forgive everything under condition that we know everything. There are other examples of historical memory approach. Unfortunately, we have a problem with the technical video that I was hoping to show you. So I'll just conclude by saying that Estonia is a middle ground in the lustration paradigm. There's a problem with, on one hand, the forgive and forget approach. There, it's psychologically difficult because victims don't have the chance to have their suffering recognized. And it's politically difficult because you leave in power so many of those who were guilty in the first place. This approach was seen in Spain, for example, when the officials who served under Franco were basically just trusted to go forth and be Democrats from here on in. And that took a very long time to right itself. If justice is postponed in the name of reconciliation, people can come to believe also that the revolution didn't happen, and it can lead to significant disappointment and a sense of apathy among people who were leading the revolution in the first place. That's something I've heard just from being in a few days in Tunisia, that there haven't been enough change, and that maybe the revolution wasn't really a revolution at all. So this is why the process of lustration is important. But in doing so, you have to be careful not to go too far to the other approach. Whether by a need for revenge, or whether you want to be ideologically pure, the idea that people should just clean house comes up often in revolutions. Now, it sounds innocuous enough in English, but in Russian, the term чистка, which means clean house, was the word used for Stalin's great purges, in which tens of thousands of people were executed for imagined political violations against the state. Same impulse also led to the Reign of Terror, actually, in France. And when the Jacobins rebelled against the French monarchy and then ended up eating themselves, essentially, in a bout of revolutionary fervor. So if a new democratic government anywhere in the world is to avoid either slow strangulation by elements of the old regime or quick guillotining by its own revolution, it would do well to emulate Estonia's normal and pragmatic approach, I think, of coming to terms with its past while also securing its future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emmet. I think that many issues will need maybe to be developed, and this is up to you to launch the debate very soon. But I think that we have the obligation to jump in this region. And this is the reason why I'm very honored to introduce Nasser Weddady, who is focused on Arab Spring countries. In his quality of Director for Outreach for Human Rights within American Islamic Congress, he has a very large experience of different issues, and I would very much like to ask you, how do you see the transitional justice or political justice? Is there any justice possible, and how to deal with this difficult totalitarian past?
I think that experiences like Estonia, South Africa, the Czech Republic, amongst other, Germany, DDR, provide excellent models for us to use in the Arab world. The problem is that in some of the countries currently, the lack of sort of institutional work that is specifically targeted at that has complicated things enormously. So, for example, instead of having truth and reconciliation commissions, in some instances you see countries moving directly, introducing something like the term in Arabic is قانون العزل السياسي, which roughly translates to the law of political isolation, which is very much a purge. And it is, for example, in Libya, ironically, it was introduced by the Muslim Brotherhood after they lost the election, in order to basically paint their opponents as former regime lackeys. There's a hot debate going on right now right here in Tunisia about such a law. And again, it is seen as a political football, where people are more interested in using it to score political points and make very tactical short-term gains than addressing the actual legacy of totalitarianism. And of course you have, for example, the ongoing struggle in Egypt, where people, depending on how you define this, at least a segment of Egyptian society, still believes that the revolution is ongoing, whereas another segment of Egyptian society says that the revolution has ended by the election of their own candidate in the presidential election. So in other words, across the Arab region, there is a sentiment that a step is being skipped in the process of healing the legacy of the authoritarian and dictatorial regimes. And like another example is Yemen, that is having right now which is, by the way, Yemen is the great forgotten country of quote-unquote Arab Spring nation. They're having right now their own transitional dialogue. But again, even then, you can hear civil society members and even parts of society making a very, very legitimate complaint that the process has been turned, by the way, through a very heavy top-to-bottom approach and intervention, active intervention from foreign powers to impose a certain status quo that glosses over the crimes committed by the former regime. And these are some of the realities of the Arab world today. And I think that the big tragedy is that in the process of turning a requirement, a prerequisite of these revolutions, the fact that we want, like, people want to put their tyrants on trial. They want to have people who committed atrocities repressed, pillaged, and plundered their wealth for decades on end, to have them pay for their crimes is one of the reasons, the trigger, that what began the process of these revolts. But I think that the tricky part, and that's, I think, where we can learn a lot from the experiences of the countries that I mentioned, South Africa, Czech Republic, Estonia, Germany, is that precisely to turn that process into something meaningful beyond the vindictiveness of pay for their crimes. Because locking up these people, and I know this, I'm saying this as a Mauritanian. My country had a short democratic transition before the Arab uprisings, and at one point was the poster child of Arab democracy. Offers an interesting lesson in there, which is actually the opposite of the point that I'm describing. The point that I'm describing is just locking up these people merely and without dealing with the legacy that they left is a mistake. And the mistake that was committed in Mauritania was actually the opposite. In Mauritania, we had a series of racial killings. In the end of the 80s, early 90s, there was racially motivated purges of the armed forces that were targeted against Black African or Afro-Mauritanian officers. So at the time, the international community, the famous Cotonou declaration by French President François Mitterrand, that basically demanded that the end of one junta to be over, and imposed, like, basically the requirement to have a multi-party democratic processes. So Mauritania did exactly that, and when the elections took place and the regime basically took off the military uniforms and put on suits, because really that's what happened, and those elections in 1991 were rigged. The first thing that the quote-unquote newly elected parliament did was to issue an amnesty law, a blanket amnesty law that already forgave all those who were implicated in the racial killings in the period between 89 and 91. And they did it pro forma, and it passed unchallenged. And it was, to be the devil's advocate, in their case, it was understandable they would do that, because these were the very same people who were running the machinery of the government from top to bottom in the military institution. And then we had another winter, let's put it that way, and then we had another democratic transition that was even more promising, where collectively, the political class, both opposition and loyalist, came to a sort of unwritten gentleman's agreement that we're not going to open any of these files. But the problem was that during these intermittent years, in the process of these racial killings, there were about 18,000 Mauritanians that were deported from their country to Senegal and Mali. And the only concession that transition made in this issue was to accept the notion of repatriating these people. And I would illustrate this anecdote like the problem, which is no one in Mauritania ever paid for their crimes, with a personal story. My own grandfather was a government minister for a very long period from the foundation of the Republic until the early 80s. And sometime around 1982, he was suspected of plotting or thinking of plotting a coup. So the military ruler at that time put him in jail for 3 years and a half, and he remained in jail until the next coup released him. Fast forward about 18 years later, in 1994, I was with my grandfather, and we were going to visit a family member who was in a hospital, in a military hospital, for treatment. And then I realized that I ran and bumped into my neighbor, who happened to be the son of that specific president that jailed my father and my grandfather, and told me that his father, the ex-president, was in the hospital receiving treatment. So I mentioned that in front of my grandfather. My grandfather immediately sprang up and said, "We have to go greet him." And so we went and entered and visited the former president, and an outsider, a non-Mauritanian, watching that scene would have thought that these were the best friends in the world, and that these are intimate friends. And a non-advised observer would have thought, would have never guessed that one of them locked the other up for 3 years and a half in a 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter jail cell. And when that person came out, he couldn't walk straight. And yet here they were chumming up and acting like best friends in the world. For the outsider, the outsiders, you would think that this is a show of like basically a magnanimous way, like the chivalry of the Mauritanian ways. Whereas those of us in the activist class, we think of this as the quintessential tragedy in our history, that no one ever pays for their crimes. And my warning and my fear is that amidst political jockeying and amidst party politics, that like the Arab world will be committing the same mistake, but on a much larger scale, whereas we will never learn lessons from our history in order to move forward towards more tolerant, open, and yes, liberal democracies, not just democracies, liberal democracies.
Nasser, many thanks for this very personal note. I think that this is very illustrative history and a big challenge to be addressed. I think that this reconciliation you speak about has several levels: spiritual, political, cultural. And I think that this is an issue that we could develop during our panel as well. My last panelist is Hisham Almirat from Global Voices Advocacy, he works there as director, And I think that Hisham, you could speak also from the perspective of this very region of Tunisia and of Arab Spring countries, maybe also about reconciliation.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, actually, something interesting is happening in the Arab world. And by the way, I think the title of our session is a kind of a misnomer when it comes to the Arab world. It's more of dealing with an authoritarian present than it is, an authoritarian past. Because even those countries that have witnessed, a revolutionary process, we haven't really witnessed an attempt to deal with that past in a, shall I say, psychotherapeutic way. I mean, looking back at the past, learning from mistakes that were made before, and trying to build the foundations for a real liberal democracy, to quote my friend Nasser. And what we see instead is somehow a review of the recent past, and also of the official history, not by established institutions or authorized spaces, but rather by the citizens, and by this new phenomenon that is called citizen media, citizens augmented by the internet. What we see is a review of television archive with people commenting on, for example, particularly gruesome events like in Syria, or, for example, in Morocco, there are some, where I come from, by the way, there are some, very harsh speeches that were made by the previous king that have become viral because they have attracted, public debate around particular issues, particular words that were used at the time and that people could not imagine using today. So there is, the public in this part of the world is kind of is reclaiming ownership of its history, and it is taking the lead on a cathartic exercise that is not necessarily led by governments, who are still struggling, actually, to find their way through this post-revolutionary phase that we are going through right now. But let me give you one example that I can speak of in more details, maybe, and that is the country I come from, Morocco. In 2000, just to give you a very quick, snapshot about the recent past in Morocco. Before or between 1962 until 1999, the country was ruled by King Hassan II. Sorry, and it was the Cold War. There wasn't the internet. The media was not very, as developed as we know it today. There was no such a thing as citizen media, and certainly no independent press. And especially during the late 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s, Morocco has gone through one of the darkest, years of its history. We call that period the years of lead. People used to be disappeared only for expressing critical views vis-à-vis the regime, or vis-à-vis maybe religion, or also vis-à-vis Western Sahara, because there is a conflict in southern Morocco around a particular region. And torture was also, police brutality and torture was also very common at that period. And I remember that particular period because I was a child growing up in Rabat at the time, and my grandmother used to warn me not to talk. I mean, to be afraid of three things. She used to say the sea, the fire, and the makhzen. And the makhzen in Morocco is the generic name for the regime, for the authoritarian regime. And you couldn't really have a public debate about anything at the time. But what happened during the 90s, the late 90s, the old king, Hassan II, he was terminally ill. Probably he had cancer, we don't know. But what happened is he opened up the system. And actually, in Morocco, we witnessed an early Arab Spring in Morocco during the second half of the 90s. And that was a political move by the dying king to try to prepare the ground for a smooth transition for his own son. And it was a particular period because there was suddenly we started having a flourishing and very lively media environment. A lot of independent newspapers were funded at that period, and suddenly the press started doing its job. All of a sudden, overnight, we started talking about secret prisons. We started talking about prominent figures and officials within the army or within the government who are responsible for torturing people and human rights exactions, etc. But then the king died in 1999, and in 2004, the current king decided to create a so-called Equity and Reconciliation Commission. It was a huge step because it was unprecedented in the Arab world, and the idea was to talk about the recent past, and it was meant to be a cathartic exercise. But we were asked, actually, please talk about the past. Let's work out a kind of a reconciliation, but please don't say the whole truth. And more importantly, don't name the torturers, and please don't ask for justice, basically. So it was really short-lived. The commission itself was composed of very prominent and very respected human rights activists, and I think they've done their job very correctly. And they handed over a report to the current king, and we are still to this day waiting for the recommendations that appeared on that particular report to be implemented. It is true that some of the victims of torture were compensated to a certain extent, but no one was arrested, and there was no naming and shaming. So basically, actually, we have to be very careful when we talk about reconciliation, because it may be also used by those regimes which, their DNA is still pretty much loaded with authoritarian reflexes and repressive mentality. They use that as an artificial way of, helping people feel that something is going on, but at the end of the day, there isn't, as Nasser rightly pointed out, there is no building of a foundation for those kind of things not to happen in the future. It's more of a PR exercise than anything else. And I've seen this throughout the Arab world, at least that region that I know better. In Latin America, there have been interesting examples, in particular in Chile or in places like Argentina. But in Brazil, it's still, people still have to come to terms with their military junta, for example. So, we have to be very careful when we talk about these things, because, they can be used for political purposes and not for justice per se.
Ishan, many thanks. I think that you pointed the finger to a very sensitive issue, reconciliation as a mean for hiding the truth and the responsibilities. Listening to all of you, I had an idea that we could maybe propose before that we launch the debate. There is something that we can do as civil society or as a web community, and that is terrifically absent by the time running on, because there is something that becomes obvious with the years going on, and this is the absence of facts or absence of documents, because the direct victims or direct testimonies will disappear, and what will remain will be only the documents officially published by the regime. And if you imagine how a historian trying to work correctly and seriously on the matter will have to work with, he will have only official documents by the police or by the justice, twisting completely the truth. And in our country, Czech Republic, a small association was launched. Its name is Postbellum, and they are publishing stories, interviews on radio and on web of direct people present during the facts or during a specific period of time. And I think that this kind of oral history becomes part of this official history that will remain once they disappear them too. So maybe one small idea that with the years, 20 years after the fall of communism, we have still a desperate need of facts and of people who could speak about what they lived in or what they had to survive. So let's maybe open the debate. We have 30 minutes to exchange, and who would like to take the floor first? Yes, sir. 4 rows.
My name is Robert Guerra. I'm with the Citizen Lab of the University of Toronto. I missed a little bit of the session. This is something of particular interest for me because my background is Spanish and have done a lot of work in Latin America. And I'm just curious what the comments would be on the trial that recently took place in Guatemala, where justice is not still finished, where there's been a great deal of documentation, but it's, as I think as one of your colleagues, Hisham, mentions, it's kind of justice interrupted. But it's the testimony is there, except that justice hasn't come to a conclusion yet. And so I'm just curious, what other countries or regions I think are good places to make linkages maybe with MENA where that have similar things. So you mentioned Latin America. I'm just curious if there are specific examples that would be good. There's a sort of a solidarity, and you were mentioning, sir, as well, for the Czech Republic and elsewhere. So I think this is a much needed debate and discussion, but I think it's a good way also to create a solidarity. It's not something new, and to building on it, I think is much needed. So I commend you for this topic of this session.
Could you just develop more the case? Maybe that
the details of the case, for if you're not familiar, there's a 10-year-long trial in Guatemala, actually against, at the time, the sitting president for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And one of a variety of NGOs not only did forensic exhumations, they did witness testimonies. That was introduced into open court. It's one of the few times that in a national court these two charges have been laid. The president was found guilty on all charges, and then through some strange appeal mechanism, the verdict was reversed, and the witnesses had to, their testimony was removed even though it was presented in open court. So I think it's it's there, and so a lot of the witnesses, they said they had their ability to have actually told their story.
Yep.
That was particularly important. So I'm just curious in terms of the question is, that's the example kind of for Guatemala, but if there are other countries that may have not come up where it would be good to do a solidarity where internet freedom is also challenged.
Thank you. I mean, maybe let's have a second question. Second row, I think. Le monsieur, deuxième.
تحية طيبة، شكرا جزيلا للمتدخلين الثلاث، خصوصا المتدخل الأول الذي تحدث عن تجربة في الحدود الأوروبية التي تمنح الضحايا حق الولوج إلى الأرشيف. أعتقد أننا في دول الربيع العربي وفي عدة بلدان إفريقية حصلت فيها تجاوزات كبيرة في مجال حقوق الإنسان، يجب أن تتاح للضحايا مثل هذه التجربة. وعودة إلى الموضوع الذي تعرض له الأخ ناصر الذي هو ابن وطني وموريتاني وأخ عز علي، أريد أن أشير فقط إلى مصادفة بودي لو يستمع الأخ ناصر، أريد أن أشير إلى مصادفة هنا في القاعة. الأخ ناصر من موريتانيا مثلي تماما، أنا من أبناء الضحايا، يعني أن والدي كان عسكريا نجا من عمليات التصفية في التسعينات لأنه كان خارج البلد، قتل فيها 2 من أعمامي الشقاء، شنقا في ليلة 28 كما يعرف الأخ نوفمبر 91. أحدهما اسمه إبراهيم جالو والآخر اسمه الحسن جالو، أحدهما أكبر من الآخر. قال الضابط الأكبر للسيد الذي يشرف على شنقهم: رجاء اترك أخي لأمي واشنقني. حدثت تجاوزات رهيبة. أنا كتبت سلسلة عن هذا الموضوع فيها: وكان الرجل يربط في سيارتين برجليه وتنطلق كل سيارة في اتجاه مختلف فلا يسمع إلا طقطقة عظامه وهي تنكسر. دونك أسجل شجاعة الأخ ناصر لأنه من بين زملاء، من بينهم جمال اليسع، اسماء شابة نحن نعترف لها بالجميل لأنهم رفعوا قضيتنا بعيدا حول العالم، ونرجو أن يشاركوا أيضا في الإصلاح وفي المصالحة في مكان، لأن النظام يلعب سياسة النعامة. الجنرالات وكبار الضباط الذين أشرفوا بأسمائهم على عمليات تقتيل هم الموجودون الآن على رأس السلطة. أنا كلامي كضحية أكثر منه موضوعية كلام الأخ ناصر، ولا أنا أريد من الجميع يحيي الأخ ناصر على شجاعته هذه بخصوص التجربة المغربية. بخصوص التجربة المغربية، صحيح أنه لم تتم ملاحقة الجنات، لكن المغرب أيضا عرف فضاء جديد. لكن سؤالي الأخ هشام: هل الحركات الاحتجاجية الأخيرة في المغرب تدرج ضمن مطالبها كشف ماضي حقوق الإنسان أم هي فقط مطالب اجتماعية؟ شكرا لكم.
Maybe let's start with Morocco, then Nasser, and maybe afterwards Guatemala, who will wish. Please.
هو سؤال شوية معقد يعني، لأنه الحركات الاحتجاج المغربية لم تكن مؤطرة أيديولوجيا، هي فقط كانت تطالب فعلا كانت تطالب بتغييرات جذرية في المغرب، من سبيل يعني فصل السلط والشفافية من ناحية يعني الامتيازات رجال السلطة، وبعض الفصائل داخل حركة التغيير المغربية، حركة المطالبة بالتغيير في المغرب، كانت بالفعل تطالب بفتح يعني أو بتعويض أو جبر الضرر ل يعني ضحايا سنوات الرصاص في المغرب، لكنها لم تكن مطلب من المطالب الأساسية في المغرب. لأنه لنكن واضحين يعني ولنكن موضوعيين، ما دفع الشباب المغربي إلى الشارع هو أولا وقبل كل شيء يعني محاولة التخلص من النظام كما هو حاليا، ثم محاولة الإصلاح تأتي بناء على أساس سليم، أساس ديمقراطي، وفصل للسلط، وبالخصوص قضاء مستقل. في بلداننا القضاء غير مستقل، وقضاء تليفونات، قضاء يعني القاضي يمكن أن يحصل على مكالمة هاتفية ويحكم. يعني هذه مسألة عادية في بلداننا للأسف الشديد. وبالتالي كانت أولويات هذه الحركة وحركة 20 فبراير، للأسف الأخت زينب ليست معنا هنا، وهي من أعضاء حركة 20 فبراير، المطالب الأساسية كانت مطالب نظامية، وبعدين نشوف في المستقبل نشوف حيثيات التطور.
Thank you very much. Nasser, you would maybe like to react.
I'll react in Arabic if it doesn't. بالنسبة لقضية موريتانيا، يعني التاريخ اللي ذكر 28 نوفمبر 1991 اللي ما ذكر الأخ جبريل، هو أن 28 نوفمبر هو عيد الاستقلال للجمهورية الإسلامية الموريتانية، وهذا خلق، يعني هذه هي عمق المأساة في موريتانيا، أن بسبب تصرفات هذا النظام أنه هذه الجرائم بحق الإنسانية التي ارتكبت إلى اليوم، كل يوم 28 نوفمبر اللي هو المفروض أنه رمز الجمهورية، رمز استقلال الجمهورية، أصبح عيد يفرق الموريتانيين. والكارثة طبعا أن المسألة صارت تهدد الوحدة الوطنية لهذه الدولة، لأن بسبب تصرفات هذه الأنظمة خلقت وضعا أصبحت الجمهورية تمثل للبعض رمزا للسيادة والسلطة والقوة، وللآخر أصبحت ذكرى الاستقلال ذكرى المذبحة. وهذا ليس فقط استطراد شاعري على القضية، لكنه يعيد ويلفت الانتباه لضرورة القيام بعمليات مصالحة وإقامة حوارات من أجل التعامل مع الماضي الصعب، لأنه إن لم يتم التعامل مع هذا الماضي فستتفاقم هذه المشاكل لدرجة للأسف. مثلا عندنا مثال السودان مثال حي على فشل جزء من المجتمع في تقبل الظلم التاريخي الذي حاق بالجزء الثاني من المجتمع، فكانت النتيجة في النهاية الانفصال. ربما الانفصال شيء جيد للجنوبيين وحق لهم، لكن في النهاية الكثيرون من السودانيين الذين أعرفهم شخصيا قالوا أنهم لم يفهموا ولم يحسوا بالمشكلة إلا بعد قيام الانفصال، أي بعد فوات الأوان. وطبعا الانفصال في السودان لم يأتي هكذا، أتى بعد حرب استمرت 22 سنة. وأمثلة مثل هذه ومثل المأساة التي وقعت عندنا في موريتانيا أظن أنها تمثل تحذيرا للمجتمعات العربية الثانية التي تمر إما بحالة حراك ثوري أو ما زالت تخوض حروبا تحررية من الأنظمة القمعية، لأنه وأظن أن هذه هي المسألة التي لا زال الكثيرون لا يتطرقون إليها، هي أنه في خلال هذه المعارك التحررية أيضا تقع جرائم من كلا الطرفين، وتلك الجرائم تمثل وقودا لهذه الحروب. فإذا إذا لم يتم التصالح والتعامل وفتح الملفات لن تنتهي هذه الحروب، ولن نصل إلى استقرار يمكننا من بناء مجتمعات حرة مفتوحة ذات ديمقراطية ليبرالية.
Thank you very much. I think that your point on holidays is also very important, because holidays which are by a political regime focused as a moment of feast or of identification after the fall of a regime becomes or has a completely different signification. Emmet, maybe you would like to speak, to take the floor as well? Guatemala, maybe?
Just to talk about Guatemala, because I think that case is important and we don't want to leave that out. I think that what the Guatemala case actually underlines is what I was getting at in my presentation, that a true transitional justice approach has to have more than one dimension. And if you just have trials alone, that isn't going to do it. You mentioned the legal technicalities. This is the kinds of thing that happens when you have personnel in the judicial system especially who were trained in, sometimes loyal to, but certainly schooled in the mentality of the previous regime. And so in order to have that accounting for the past, you also have to, again, have illustration process and have a societal accounting at the same time. One alone tends not to do it.
Maybe another round of questions. First row. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to talk in Arabic. I'm sorry. بالنسبة للتاريخ, en ce qui concerne the history, it's very important. I'm sorry, I'm switching to English at the same time. It's very important that we make history, and for me, it's very interesting what you said about the NGO that was speaking about what's happening, because I think that, especially for us in Tunisia, not only in the Arabic world, that we are not aware of what happened in 50 years, not just 23rd years of Ben Ali, because maybe I'm aware of some stories, some facts, okay, but not all the people of Tunisia. And I think it's very, very important for media or CSO, civil society organization, to show to everybody what happens in the era of Ben Ali and Bourguiba at the same time, to make them aware that, and at the same time to not make some holidays, okay, divide peoples, because maybe some of them remember that there was a crimes, and some others says, no, with Ben Ali we were okay, we were fine, you know, there was nothing from what we are saying, you know. And this step, it's very important to make it clear in the mind of everybody in a country. And I think that your example is very important, but we must at the same time try to make history from a group first, and after that going to person by person. I don't know, maybe in Estonia you can talk about that. How did you go further with that step to make everybody aware of what happened, you know? Okay, that's my question.
As I mentioned a bit in my presentation, that process took an awful long time in Estonia. It was done primarily through the judicial system in the first place, but also through historians who were investigating them. But the problem is that in Estonia too, even 20 years after communism ended, there are still problems, and they actually are coalescing around this particular issue of celebrations. In Estonia, there's about 35 to 40% of the population who are actually not ethnic Estonian, but ethnic Russian, and their view of history on a local group level is actually very different than that of most Estonians. They see, again, that the role of the Soviet Union was positive, and so when in World War II commemorations, it becomes a major flashpoint for conflict. They're trying to address it through the education system, and they've had a lot of progress so far. But if there really are completely different views that are so well entrenched that they're being passed to the younger generation, it can be very, very hard to deal with.
Maybe one word commenting your issue. I will come back to this association named Post-Bellum. It's very interesting because at the fall of communism, people said everyone knew what happened. It was obvious. But by the time, many people died, and many souvenirs just were also avoided. And at the end of the day, you have the same books of history than you had 15 years ago. And this is the reason why this small activity becomes very important. Their emission, their broadcasting in public radio is one of the most popular today. And they published many issues on the web and also in books. And at the end of the day, it can become even a very good business. But they started with very few money raising everywhere, because it was just some kind of Don Quixote approach. So, yes, two questions.
Thank you. So, I mean, when we keep talking about transitional justice, we keep focusing on the legal, social, political views. I rarely hear mentioning the economic side of the whole thing. I mean, the problem with the transitional justice and keeping up with the same elites, the business elites, the economic elites that is normally still holding or used to hold the political power, basically things would not change because it's all about money and the economy drives politics, etc., etc. It would be interesting to keep discussing the same topic, but keeping in the view or basically focusing on the impact of transitional justice on the economy or how the economic power or elites impacts the transitional justice. I would be interested to hear your views on this.
Excellent question. And first row, la première.
Thank you. My question is pretty much kind of similar to my previous speaker's question, and is related to the how to deal with the previous era, especially in the Arab Spring countries, mainly in Tunisia and Egypt, probably so in Yemen as well. Do you think, I would like to address my question to Mr. Hisham and to Nasser especially. And do you guys think that the Egypt and Tunisia must replicate, for example, the Moroccan, especially the Moroccan experience when it comes to the Reform and Reconciliation Committee, sort of like reconciliation with the past, sort of like given, not like so pushing the justice too much in Tunisia and Egypt, like put in the figures of the previous regime in the jails and throw in the businessmen or forcing them to escape out of the country. That's going to hurt the economy. Do you think that they should sort of, like they did in Morocco, the regime of Mohammed VI, that they gave them a lot of money to the people who were jailed, but at the same time they didn't punish the people who were involved in violations of abuse of human rights. Thank you.
Hisham, maybe you could address this issue of Moroccan experience.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the question of our friend at the front encompasses somehow some of the aspects of the previous question that our friend, who's also from Morocco, has asked. Just a couple of points, just to make clear what happened in Morocco, actually. In Morocco, we moved from a totalitarian, authoritative, and repressive regime into a economically monopolistic, if you like, regime where the executive is held by a small oligarchy surrounding the king, basically. That's what we call the makhzan in Morocco. What happened actually is it's a cathartic process. People came, basically, this is how it happened. People came to a room like this one in front of cameras, and it was broadcasted live. When I say people, I mean the victims of the years of lead, the so-called years of lead. Victims of torture, mothers of disappeared activists and leftists in particular who disappeared in the 70s. Their fathers, their sisters, etc. And it was a weeping exercise. People just came in front of the camera to weep and to share their grievances with the rest of the population. So it somehow created a sense of relief, but there wasn't much compensation after that. And more importantly, the commission mandate was very clear from the start. They were not allowed to name anyone who was responsible for the torture for torture crimes. No one was named, and no one came in front of the camera. There was no confrontation between the victims and the torturers, and consequently, no one was punished, and there was no judicial process. So I would advise against going down that way. And it's true, actually. If there is a distinction that needs to be made between a very healthy reconciliation process where, as a society, from the beginning, we agree that this is not a vendetta, this is not a witch hunt, it's not a McCarthy Commission renewed again. It's just about, a process, a healthy process for the society, but also a kind of justice. It's not going to be complete, but at least it will help us put the past behind us. And that can happen without basically hurting the economy. If we agree that the kind of democracy we want is the kind of liberal democracy that has prevailed elsewhere, where you have a free market basically with fair competition between people who have the money and the possibility to invest with a clear with clear rules of the game and an independent justice. I don't see how this would hurt the economy, so long as, of course, we don't. It doesn't degenerate into something like a witch hunt or a vendetta, etc. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. Nasser.
Yeah, actually, our panel was built under the Arab, like basically one of the assumptions in it was post-Arab uprisings. In fact, there were 3 other experiences in the Arab world that should be looked at, examined very closely for historical lessons: Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Lebanon went through a 15 years civil war that claimed over 150,000 lives. And Algeria went through a decade that claimed a civil war that claimed over 250,000 dead. And then Iraq. And what is notable in these 3 cases is that the 3 countries, and somebody would very quickly make an argument that things are a little bit more complicated than I'm about to present them. Yes, they are more complicated, but there are interesting things to be learned there. Lebanon, the same warlords who effectively took part in the massacres, in the abuses, and the crimes, are the very ones who sat on the table and agreed signed this Taif agreement in 1991 that nominally ended that war. But incidentally, Lebanon has never been quite stable, a stable country, and is on the verge of on the verge of exploding at any moment. Algeria, which is sort of the stabler of these 3 examples, still is struggling with the legacy of the violence by the terrorist groups, the Islamists, the JIA and their spin-offs. And again, there wasn't much of a process like we're advocating that happened there. And one of the most notable, interesting byproducts of that war and the lack of ultimate process of airing the dirty laundry is that part of that terrorism was exported elsewhere into the Sahara, AQIM and GSPC. And in the case of Iraq, which is an even more interesting and complicated one, the Arab world just turned its back on what was done after the fall of Saddam Hussein, on the political premise that because this was an invasion by a foreign power, nominally the United States and Great Britain, therefore that invalidates everything that was done after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Even though that the Iraqis did conduct trials that ultimately led to the demise of Saddam Hussein. But I think the most interesting thing here and to remember is that within the Arab world today, virtually no one wants to look at the example of Iraq because it was a process started by foreign powers, which is a legitimate point in the minds of some, but I find it interesting because there are some lessons to be learned from what happened in Iraq, particularly the crimes that were committed against the Kurds, the gassing of Halabja, and the massacres that were committed against both Sunni and Shia Iraqis by the Iraqi regime. And I think that the missed opportunity of the last decade was precisely having a process above suspicion. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the term. There's a Roman term. Caesar's wife has to be absolutely above suspicion. And in this case, the process of transition and reconciliation is Caesar's wife.
Thank you. Maybe, Emmet, you could comment the economical convertibility of old elites, because there is something that happens with old elites. They are not all in jail. They have a very prosperous life in our country, for instance. What about Estonia?
No, that's true. That's an excellent question, and the economic dimension is too often neglected in discussions like this. What I would say in general, I'll talk about Estonia in a minute, but in general, when the system is changed to a democracy, the entire system needs to be changed. Most of the people who accumulate wealth under authoritarian systems are doing so because they've bent the rules in their favor, or they're taking advantage of clientelist networks within that state. And when those kinds of changes are not done, we're not talking about expropriation, but of setting up clear and transparent rules of business. When that's not done, those elites from the old regime they have their money and their resources, and they use that then to influence the political process going forward, which you've seen in countries such as Ukraine, for example, where the oligarchs essentially fund both major political parties, and they've had a really outsized role in the political process ever since independence. In Estonia, it has worked better for a couple of reasons. The first is that the new leadership had been quite clear all along that it wanted to appropriate a Western economic model, and so they had a clear mandate to do that. So they completely changed the entire economic rules of the game. The second is that the whole region in general was not doing well after the 1990s, and as a result, the reforms that they did, the shock therapy that was implemented as strongly in Estonia as anywhere else, except maybe the Czech Republic and the region, it worked well enough such that those reforms became popular, and even many people, for example, the ethnic Russian population I was talking about, prefer to stay in Estonia because of the fact that the economic situation is doing better. And the third factor that's also not talked of enough is the impact that EU conditionality had on Estonia, that there was an outside force that set a clear set of rules and standards, one to which Estonia wanted to comply and to live up to, and which is fundamentally, if the EU is based on anything, it's based on an open market. And I think the EU has some role to play in perhaps negotiating better trade agreements with countries like Tunisia that are recovering, and stop excluding them essentially from the market and giving them an opportunity to play by those rules in the future.
Thank you very much. I think that the time has come that we close. I would like to thank you for very interesting exchange. I think that we have highlighted that the situation in every single society is different, but that we need to meet each other and to compare not only our past difficult situation, but also our hope in the future. And I would like to thank Emmet, Nasser, and Isham for a great debate. Thank you very much.